Hey, and welcome to this tutorial. Today we're going to be making a weighted pressure pad in UE4 and 5. This is going to be a similar effect to the compassion cubes in Portal. However, we're actually going to take this one step further and be able to use any physical object in the world. But yeah, with that said, let's get into the tutorial. Alright, so if we right click and create a blueprint class and an actor, we're going to start to create our weight pad itself. So if we call this BP underscore weight pad, if we jump into this guy, we're going to want to add a couple of assets here. So if we click add and add a cube, and let's call this base. And if we duplicate this, so Control C, Control V, and let's call this add. And for our base, if we set the scale to 3 by 3 by 0.1, and if we chuck our pad on top of our base, so it's like attached, and we set this guy's scale to 0.8 by 3, and we just want to offset this guy a little bit, so let's say, 160-ish maybe. And just so it's a little bit easier to see, I'm going to set this to the green shader here, like that, but you can add whatever you like. And lastly, we just need to add a little bit of collision so we can use this in our event graph. So if we go up to add again and we add a box collision, make sure that's on the pad itself. And let's just zero this guy out so it's 1 by 1 by 1. And let's set the scale here to 45 by 45 and then 20 in the Z axis. And then let's just push this guy up so it's sitting just on top of the button itself, like something like this. And that should be us good to go. So if we jump into our event graph, give ourselves a bit of space, we're going to want to get the overlap results of our box so that when an object is placed onto the pad, we can see what that object is. So if we go to our box, right click, and add begin overlap, and go up there again and add end overlap. We're going to use these guys to tell us what actors have been added to the pad and what actors have left the pad. Perfect, but let's set up a couple of basic parameters here. So down at our variables, if we add a variable, and let's set this variable to a float, and let's call it target weight. And if we add another one, and let's call this current weight on pad. And finally, let's add another variable, but let's call this objects on pad plus weights. Now, if we go up to our variable type, we want to change this guy to an actor, like this. But you want to change this little dude here to a map. And what this is going to allow us to do is bind one variable to another. So when an actor is added here, we can change this guy to a float, and this is going to act as the weight bound to this actor. Okay, but we need to set some of these variables. So target weight wise, let's say 100 for now. But we need to figure out what our current weight on the pad is. So what we can do is use these variables here in a function. So if we go down to functions and create one, and let's call this objects in and out of pad. Now in this function, we're going to be doing all of the calculations needed to figure out how much weight is on our pad. And the best way to keep this accurate is to hold all of our weights in this map type, which is going to keep track of all the actors that are currently on our pad, but also all of the weights associated with them. But first, we need to have a couple of inputs. So if we create an input, and let's call this in actor, and we want to change this to an actor type, like this. The second of which is going to be a primitive component, and let's just call this in comp. And the last of which is going to be a boolean, and let's call this plus question mark. And this is going to be used to filter whether or not we're adding an actor or if an actor has been thrown off the pad or has left it. Okay, So first of all, let's create a branch for our plus. So if we left click and press B and chuck our plus into the connection here. And what we want to do is, if it is being added to the pad, we want to add to our map. So if we add, like this, and we're going to add our in actor here, so we can search for in actor, like this. And to get the associated weight with that actor, we can get our in comp, like here, and we can get its mass, like this. Now if it's false, we're going to want to skip this entirely and we're going to just remove it later on in the calculation. So if we drag out of here, create a reroute node, like this, and just connect this guy up, we'll move along the line a little bit. So after this point, what we want to do is check if this is empty. Now if it is empty, we want to set our current weight to 0 because there's nothing on the pad. But if it's not empty, we're going to want to add our new actor that's just been added to the pad to our current weight. So what we can do is duplicate this guy down here. We're going to want to find our actor and its weight. So we can say in actor. We want to get our plus to say, is it plus or minus? And we can select with this. And if it is a plus, we can chuck this guy in here, so the weight of our actor can be added in. But if it's not a plus, what we can do is we can multiply this by -1, which will kind of invert it. And then all we need to do is add these together. So we can add our current weight with this value. And lastly, just for safety, we're going to clamp this to our target weight. And this is just so the weight in the pad can't exceed the target weight. So all we need to do is chuck this guy into here. We can just go along a little bit. We have our weight. However, we still need to remove any assets that are currently on our map that are not on the pad. So we get our map here and we remove this guy and make sure our in actor is plugged in here. However, we only want this when the plus is set to negative. So if we get our plus, a branch, chuck this guy into the false. Cool. So now if we go back into our event graph, we can chuck one of these guys out here and duplicate this guy down here. And if we connect these guys up like this, and on the begin play one, we want this to be plus ticked on. But for the end overlap, we want this to be unticked. And the reason for this is that when the actor overlaps with our box, we want it to be added to the calculation. And when the actor leaves our overlap box, we want to start removing it from our calculation. Okay, but we need to get our button to start reacting to this a little bit. So if we pull over our event tick, we want to offset our pad's location, but only in a relative space. If we set relative location, and let's promote this to our variable and call this pad position. And we're going to want to set this guy on its Z axis because we're only going to be pushing it up and down vertically. But we really want to base this off of how much weight is on our pad. So what we need to do is create a couple of values. So if we create a variable and make sure this is a single and a float, and let's call this pad offset amount. And let's duplicate this guy and let's call this current weight %. And we're going to want to set this guy by our current weight percentage. However, we need to figure out what this guy is. So if we go back over here to our overlaps and we create a new function, and let's call this update stats. If we go over here for a second, what we want to do is create a sort of percentage between how much weight is on the pad compared to the target weight. So to calculate that, all we need to do is get our current weight on the pad and our target weight. And we're going to divide this guy by the target, like this. And we're going to clamp this to 1 and 0, just for safety. And this is going to be our percentage, like this. Now, just for a little bit of housekeeping here, what we can do is say if this is equal to this guy prior to being set, we're going to do nothing. But if it isn't, we're going to set it. Now, because we're using the event tick to move our pad around, what we can also do is drag out here and set actor tick enabled and make sure this guy's on. And if we compile and save and make sure this guy's set up after our begin overlap and end overlap, if we jump over to our event tick, what's essentially going to happen here is that this is going to act as a lerp for our value. So what we need to do is drag out here and create a lerp and connect up our pad offset, like here. And the A is going to be our base value. So our pad's Z axis is 160. So if we chuck that guy into there. And if we go into our viewport, we can kind of play about with this. So maybe something like this. Yeah, maybe like -55, maybe -50. So if we go back into our event graph, and we'll set that to -50. This can be customized, so depending on your asset and the scale of your asset, this might need its own value, but for now we're going to go with -50. And just to smooth this out, what we can do is we can drag out of here and create a f_interp2. This is just going to smooth the transition so it's not too snappy. And if we put our pad offset amount in the current and our current weight percent in the target, and out of the delta time, if we create a world delta seconds, and let's chuck in 10 for the interp speed. Cool. Now, lastly, just for a little bit of optimization, since we are using the event tick, if we duplicate these guys here and say if these are equal to one another, then we want to set actor tick enabled and we want to turn it off. Just like this. And this is just so that this guy can deactivate itself when it's not really needed. Cool. So if we compile and save, and we come into our scene, drag this guy out. Oh, and that looks a little bit wrong. So if we go back in quickly, think I just need to reset this. Yep, that's what it is. So if we put that back to 160, compile and save, that looks better. Now to test this guy out, if we go up and add a cube into our scene, and let's make sure simulated physics is ticked on. And just for testing, let's put our mass to 200. Now lastly, for any of these objects to work, all we need to do is go down here and make sure generate overlap events is ticked on. If that's not ticked on, this won't work. So now if we play, our pad should react. And if we move this guy off, it'll react. Pretty cool. And it's the same with all the actors in the scene. So if we say drag this guy over here and pop him on there, pretty cool. And just for a little bit of testing as well, if we go back into our blueprint and we make sure our target weight has the little eye icon ticked on, we go back in here. Let's set this to 500. and play again. And remember, this is set to 200, so if we pop this guy over, it doesn't actually move down as much. And if we add these guys onto here, it's going to just slowly build up. Cool. But how do we actually connect this to a door or a sort of objective kind of thing? Well, what we can do is go back into our event graph and to our update stats. After we set the tick here, what we're going to want to do is communicate with other connected actors. And the best way to do that is go to our variables and let's call this connected actors. And let's make this an actor type and a soft object reference. Okay, and for now, let's make this an array as well, so that we can actually connect multiple actors to this weight pad if we want. And then if we go down here and tick on the little eye, we can add these in while we're back in the scene. Okay, so if we drag this guy out, and we for each loop, like this, we're going to want to tell these actors the current weight that's on this pad, or at least the current percentage of completion. So what we can do, if we jump out here for a second, and we right click and create a blueprint interface, and let's call this BPI weight pad. Let's jump in here. And if we rename this guy here to current weight values, and all we need to do is add a little input here. So if we create a float, and let's call this weight %, and compile and save. And if we go back to our weight pad and right click and create weight pad values, and make sure this is the one with the little message. And if we chuck this guy into the element here, it'll create a sort of conversion node for you. This guy up here. And all we want to do is add our current percentage, like this. Cool. But we need an actual objective or door to open. So if we come out here and right click and create another blueprint and an actor, and let's call this BP underscore weight door. And let's open this guy up. And we just need to add a couple of assets here so we have something to work with. So if we add a static mesh, and I'm going to be using some of the assets from the starter content. If you don't have that in your project, all you need to do is go to add features and content packs, go to content, and then add this to the project. You'll get a load of goodies, but you'll also get assets like walls and doors that we're going to be using in this tutorial. All right. So now that you've got those assets, if we go back into our blueprint, and I'm going to search for wall door, and I'm going to use the 300 one there. And I'm going to duplicate this guy, and I'm going to set this guy to the wall 400 by 400. Cool. So if I chuck this guy under here and rename this to door, and let's just scale this guy in a little bit. So let's say 2.5, 2.8 maybe, yeah. And chuck this guy over a wee bit. Maybe squeeze it in so it's a bit easier to see. Yeah, perfect. Scale it down like this. And just so it's a little bit easier to see, I'm going to set the material to something red. Like maybe this guy here so it's easier to see. And now that that's set up, we can go into our event graph. Cool. Now, just before we do anything else here, if we go up to our class settings, and we add in our weight pad BPI, so BPI weight pad, like this. And now that that's been implemented, we should have our interface panel here, so we can right click and create our current weight values, like this. And what we want to do is save this value. So if we promote this guy, like this, However, I want to add a little bit more functionality so that we have a couple more options going forward. So let's create a boolean and let's call it only update when complete. And what we can do with this is ask a question here. So a branch. And if this is false, we can connect this guy straight up here. But if this is true, we only want this to be a value of 0 or 1 and nothing in between. So what we can do is ask, is this equal to 1? And chuck the boolean into our float, like this. Now the only other thing we want to do here is create another boolean and say is complete. Like here. And this guy needs to be connected up to is equal to 1. Because when this value is equal to 1, we should be opening the door. Cool. So to actually open the door, just like our wait pad, we're going to be using the event tick. And we're actually going to be using the exact same technique. So if we get our door, and if we set relative location, and we save this guy, and let's call this door position. And if we set this guy, and then split this, instead of the Z value, we're going to be doing the X value, because that's the side-to-side value here. So out of the X, if we lerp, like this, and we're going to promote the alpha to a variable, and let's call this door open amount. And our standard position is 145, so we'll just chuck that guy into there. And our open amount, let's say in here, something like this, so maybe 30 or something. So we chuck in 30, like that. Now all we need to do is get our open amount. So if we drag in our open amount and set it, and if we f-interp 2, just like in the wait pad, and we want to interpolate between our current open door amount and our wait percent, like this. And if we chuck in our delta time, and then finally chuck in 5 for our interp speed, but you can experiment with this. And just before our event tick, if we do our check here, so if our open amount is the same as our wait percent, we want to deactivate our event tick. And when we update this guy, we want to make sure our event tick is ticked on. Compile and save. Now, just before we go back into our scene, if we make sure our only update when complete has its little eye icon ticked on, and we add our door into here, and we make sure this guy is connected up. So if we click on our pad and go to connected actors, add one of these here. And if we find our actor by using our eyedropper and clicking on it here, and if we play, it should start updating. Cool. And just for testing, if we duplicate this guy over and we tick on only update when complete and make sure this is connected up. So again, just add that to your array. And now go back into our scene. You'll notice this guy doesn't update. If we just add a couple more cubes here, maybe something like this, when it hits the target, that's when it opens. And then if we just remove it, it'll close shut. Cool. Now we're almost fully set up here, however there's a couple of little details that we need to add for this to be production ready. So if we go back into our weight pad, something that we're going to have to add in is a sort of way of getting the player's weight. Currently, if the player walks on top of the pad, it's going to use the weight from the collision capsule of the player character, rather than the weight set up for the character itself. So if we go back into our object in and out, and go over here, we're going to want to set up something specific for the player. And the easiest way to do this is just after our branch here, go over here, and we get our in actor. And we ask, does implement interface? And we want this to be BPI underscore weight pad. And if it does, we're going to get the weight of our player. But if it doesn't, we're just going to chuck that guy into there as usual. Cool. But we're going to have a custom event here to get the weight from the player. So if we go back up to our BPI weight pad and we add a function here, and let's call this get on weight. And in the outputs, if we add an output, and let's make sure it's a float, and let's call this weight / mass. Compile and save. Now back in our weight pad, if we get our actor up here, and then we get our pawn weight, like this, chuck this guy into here. And the only thing we need to do is duplicate this guy up here, like this. And then connect this guy up to the pin like this. Perfect, so we can get the weight from our character. However, we do need to set this guy up in our player character itself. Now, I'm going to be using the third person character in this tutorial, but you can use your own player character as well. But if I search for this guy and open this guy up, and if we go to our interfaces and make sure we have this plugged in, so if we call BPI underscore weight pad, compile and save, and I'm going to get an error because I've already got my test one in, so I'm going to remove that for now. Compile again. And if we go to our interfaces, and I'm going to get on weight, and if we double click on this guy, we're going to open up this function here. And what we're going to do is get our character movement component, drag out here, and get mass, like this. We can chuck that guy into there. And what this is going to do is get the mass set up in this guy here, which is set right here. Now, the reason that we're using this over the likes of the capsule mass or something like that is that this is physically accurate to the character itself. So that's how much they can be pushed around. It can be how fast they move and how high they jump. However, for your project, you can either use this or even a custom amount in here. It's really up to you. Now that that's set up, we can go back in here to our weight pad, jump on into the game and play viewport. It should be more accurate. Perfect. Now that's all the basic setup and it should be working from now on. However, there is one thing missing, and that is if you have more than one object stacked on top of each other, the pad's not going to know about the one above it. So for example, if we simulate our scene and I stack this guy on top of this cube, it doesn't know. And that's because our collision is only at the bottom of the pad. So to sort this, what we can do is go back into our weight pad and into our event graph, give ourselves a little bit of space down here. We're going to want to set up a system that periodically checks whether or not there are any objects on top of each other. And we're going to do that with box traces. So if we right click and create a custom event, and let's call this check objects. And let's just add a little input here, call it state, and make sure it's a Boolean for now. And out of this guy, what we want to do is first check whether or not we have any objects on the pad itself. So if we say is empty, if it is empty, we're going to leave blank for now. And if it's not, we're going to use whatever we have commanded it to do. So we can create another branch and stick that into the state for now. Now out of the true, what we want to do is set timer by event. Let's chuck on looping and max once per frame for now. And we want our time to be a variable. And let's call this object time check. Maybe set this to 0.25. And this is going to be how long it waits between each check that we're going to be doing. Now, just before we go any further, for the false here and true here, we're going to want to clear or cancel our timer. So if we clear or invalidate, and then connect this guy up here, like this, and this guy here, like this. So if we have an object on our pad, and we want to check our objects, we're going to trigger our timer, and we're going to do a couple of things with that in a second. But if we don't have anything on the pad, or we're going to try and cancel it, it'll cancel this and stop it from triggering. Cool. So now if we come down here and we drag out of our event and we create another custom event, and let's call this timer check. And we're going to want to get our objects that's in our objects on pad list. And we want to get the keys, which is the actors on this list. And we're going to check whether or not it's valid. So is valid. Like this. And if it is valid, we're going to loop through these guys. And we're going to trace to see whether or not there is any actors on top of them. Cool. Now, the way we're going to do this is we're going to create a multi-box trace for objects. And we're going to collapse this guy into a function for now. So if we right click on here and we collapse the function, and let's call this trace items on pad. And let's open this guy up like this. Now if we drag our start into here, which will create a little input pin, and we make sure that's the end as well. And then if we drag our half size into here to create another pin, and our orientation. And now if we add an input and make sure it's an actor, and let's call this in actor for now, and drag this guy into the actors to ignore. And lastly, let's drag in our debug type into here, just so it's a little bit easier for us to debug this in our scene. Now let's rename start to trace location, and our half size to trace size. And we can leave orientation for now. Cool. Now the only other thing we need to do is set up our object types. Now we can create an array like here, and you can add as many of these as you like. However, for this tutorial, we're mainly using the pawn, which is our player character, and physical bodies, which is kind of like engine simulated. So with that set up, if we go over here and we create a branch out of our return value, which is just going to cut it off if there's no valid actors. And if it is valid, what we're going to do is loop through our results. And we can break our results, like here. And all we need to use is the components and the hit actor. And this is going to be used exactly the same as when we were using our box begin overlap and end overlap. Okay, so the first thing we need to do here is check whether or not this guy is actually in our list already. So if we find the hit actor here, like this, and if we do find something, we don't need to add it to anything. But if we don't find anything, what we want to do is add this object to our pad calculations. So what we can do is drag in our objects in and out of pad, connect up our hit actor to inActor and our hit component to incomp. So we just clean this guy up a wee bit like this. Cool. But what we're also going to want to do is add this guy to an array so we can refer to it later. So if we create a sequence by left clicking and pressing S, chucking this guy into there, like this. This is just going to allow us to do two things at once. And what we can do is promote this guy to a variable, and let's call this objects on top of others, in brackets current. And we want this guy to be an array. Just let that guy load. And what we want to do is add a unique version of our hit actor, like this. And compile and save. Cool. Now if we go back into our event graph, out to here, all we need to do is set up these values that we've kind of got. So the first thing we can do is add in our actor, like here. And to get the trace location, what we can do is get the bounds of this actor, and we can use the origin as the center point of this actor, but we need to offset it to the top of the actor. So what we can do is add our origin to our box extent, but we only need the up vector. So if we split this guy and also split this guy, we can add this guy into here, and then chuck this guy into the trace location. Cool. Now to get the trace size, we can get our bounding box again. And we can use our box extent. However, we want this to be slightly smaller than the actor so that if anything's sitting on top of it, it has to be well and truly on it rather than just on the edge. So if we divide this and then chuck this guy into the trace size, I would usually go with 1.7 and 4. And what this is going to do is divide the X and Y axis by 1.7, but the height axis, which is the Z axis, by 4. So it's going to squash it down a little bit. Okay, cool. Now to get the orientation, all we need to do is get actor rotation, split this, and make a rotator here, and just use the Z for now. Now just for testing, if we stick on for duration for the draw debug type, and we connect this guy up, just tidy this up a little bit, like this. Cool. We compile and save. Cool, so we're almost done now. However, we do need to check whether or not objects are still on top of each other in comparison to the last time we checked. So say for example, if an object was on top of another and then they fell off, we need to make sure that they are removed from the calculations. So if we come down here, we're going to be using the array that houses all of the objects on top of each other. However, we do need to compare this to the last loop. So if we duplicate this and rename this to last loop in brackets, and we're going to set this guy at the very end of all of this. You'll see in just a second. So what we can do is we can loop through our last one. So we loop like this, and we want to compare the two. So we're going to get our current. We're going to ask, does it contain this item? And if the current loop does not contain this item, what we're going to do is use our object in and out of pad. We're going to fire this guy into the actor, and we're going to make sure that the plus is ticked off. Just tidy this up a little bit. And then we're going to remove this guy from our last loop. Tidy this up a little bit. So if we connect this up to the complete here, we're almost good to go. However, out of complete, what we need to do is get our current, and we're going to set our last loop to the current. And then we're going to update our stats. So what's actually happening here is that we're going to loop through all the items that we used to have on our pad during our last check. And if any of those items aren't on the current list, we're going to remove them from the weight calculation. And then we're going to update anything connected to our pad. Now, a little bit of homekeeping here. If we go up to our is valid here, if it's not valid, we want to turn off our check. So if we check objects and make sure this is ticked off, if we drag this guy down here, we just want to connect this up to these guys down here, so it's all updated. And the only other thing we're going to want to do is add a little something here. Now, this is going to work perfectly with static meshes. However, if you have any simulated bodies, like a skeletal mesh or like your character or something, because they use multiple components, they use multiple collision components all over the body for different limbs and whatnot, they're going to have different values of mass. So we're going to have to add a custom calculation just for the skeletal meshes up here. So what we can do is drag out here and ask get class, like this guy. And we can ask this, is this equal to a skeletal mesh actor? Like this. And if it is, we'll go up here and do some calculations. But if it's not, we can use what we've got at the moment. So if we copy these guys up to here and connect this guy up to our trace function and our actor into the little pins here, the only real difference here is going to be our trace location. So if we drag out here and we get component by class and we search for skeletal mesh component, and out here we can get component bounds, and we're going to want to use the origin. However, we want to offset it ever so slightly. So if we add this guy, and on the z-axis, let's add 15. Now, depending on the characters that are in your game, you might need this to be higher or lower in value, but you can tweak that depending on your project. Now, if we fire this guy into the trace location, compile and save, we just tidy these guys up a little bit. Let's say this is the SM for static mesh. Maybe make this like a blue color. And this is going to be your skeletal mesh stuff. So let's make this, I don't know, like a reddy kind of color or orangey. Cool. So now if we go back into our scene and play around with this, you should be able to drag a skeletal mesh onto our pad, which is really cool. However, I just noticed we're not getting any tracing going on, which is because we haven't actually triggered this guy. So all we need to do is go to update stats, and on complete, check objects and tick this guy on. We should be good to go. Let's see. So if I drag this guy up, you'll see there's little boxes. That's not working. Okay, hold on. Let's see what's going on. If we go back into our blueprint and we go to our check objects, let's have a wee look in here. Oh, that'll be why. We need to tick this guy on here. So after we do our trace, if we do want to add it to our list, we just need to tick that little guy on there. And if we come out here, one last thing we might want to do as well is just on every check, we want to make sure this guy is clear. Like this. Now, just before we go back into our scene, we're going to want to specify exactly what objects are on our pad, and not just on top of other objects. With the current setup, some of the objects that are solidly on the pad itself can actually be lumped into this guy here. And we don't want that, because that can actually cause a lot of issues with the calculations. So if we come up here to our overlap box, like this guy here, and we give ourselves a little bit of space in between here, we're going to want to come down here and duplicate one of our arrays. So if we copy that guy, and let's rename this to objects on pad specific. Let's drag this guy out here. And what we want to do is, if an object is added to the pad, we want to add a unique to this list. And just drag in your actor like this. And if an actor leaves the pad, we want to remove the item from the array. Cool. Now, the really cool thing about this is that we can use this guy as a way of filtering out our traces. So if we go back into our trace items on pad, and we go over here just a little bit, and just before we add any of our actors to our object on top of others current array, just pull this guy along. All we need to do is check whether or not this guy is in here. So if we ask, does this contain item? And if it does, we don't want to add this to our objects on top of others. But if it isn't, we do. So if we compile and save and go back into our scene now, with that guy ticked on, and we play. And let's just move this guy up here, drop him. There we go. Should now, it should now just kind of start updating. Cool. Now, just as a little bonus thing, it's not technically part of the tutorial, but to allow your character to pick up these objects and then place them on the pad, what we can do is if we go to our character and to our event graph, what we can do is add a physics handle. So if we add in here and add a physics handle and compile and save, and we can kind of attach these items to our physics handle in the world. So what we can do just for testing is find our left mouse button, like this. And when we left click, we can do a line trace by channel. And we want to do this from our camera. So if we get our camera and we get world location, and we want to add this to our forward vector of the camera. And let's multiply this by maybe like 1,000 or something. And this is just so it can reach as far away from the camera as it needs to. So if we chuck this guy into the start and this guy into the end, and out of the return value, we want to create a branch. And if it does hit, we want to break this guy and get the hit location. Now, just so it doesn't have to be too accurate, what we're going to do is create another trace. We're going to create a sphere trace for objects, like this. And we're going to chuck our location into the start and end. Just minimize that so it's a bit near. And I'm going to set this to 10, so it's like 10 units out from the hit location. And we're only going to look for physical actors. So let's create an array and set this to physical bodies, like this. And connect this guy up. like here. So what we're going to do is we're going to shoot this line out from where the camera is looking, and we're going to trace a little sphere on the location that it hits. Now, if this sphere picks anything up, what we want to do is break this guy, just like before. Now, all we're going to use is our hit component here, but we're going to add this to our physics handle. So if we drag this guy out, and we grab at location, and we drag in our hit component, like here, but we want to get the location as well, so get location. Chuck this guy into here. And then lastly, what we want to do is create a variable. So if we go to variables and we create a boolean, and let's call it currently has pickup. And we'll just set this to true for now. Chuck this guy into here. And what we want to do is make sure this is false if this is false here. And we also want to make sure this is false if this is false here. So it should look something like this. And when we unpress our left click, what we want to do is check, do we have a pickup? And if we do, we want to get our physics handle and we want to release our component. And then we want to set our boolean to false. Cool. Now the only other thing we need to do is kind of update the location of this. So if we get our event tick, and we check if we have our pickup, like here. And if we do, we want to get our handle, and we want to set target location. And for the purposes of this tutorial, we're just going to offset it from our character, but you can say a specific location. So I'm going to get our capsule, and I'm going to get the world location. And its forward vector. And we're going to add these guys together. But just before that, I'm going to multiply this by a float. And we're going to say 100 units in front of the player. Cool. So if we compile and save, and now we go back into our scene, and we play, I should be able to pick these up. Cool. Let's actually add a little bit more height to this. So in here, if we add here, and maybe say plus 100 on the Z, and compile and save again, go back in. Let's try this again. Oh yeah, that's better. Now if we do make a little stack. Cool. But yeah, the really cool thing about this is that everything's physically based. So you can change these values in here, like the mass. You can set this guy to like 50 if you want, and then you can see it react differently. And this little guy could be like 1,000, so we can go back in, try this out. So you can see how little that has an effect. But if we add this guy, it's going to like completely open it on its own, which is really cool. But yeah, I think that's the end of this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed. If you have any questions or any feedback, leave it down in the comments below. And with that said, I'll see you guys later. Bye.